Could a single winter night redefine the balance of a war that had already consumed 2 years of Europe's security order? In the early hours of December 23rd, while much of Ukraine was still asleep, air raid sirens began to howl from Kyiv to the western regions, signaling what would become one of the largest aerial assaults of the conflict. Within hours, Russia launched a combined barrage of cruise missiles and attack drones, a strike clearly designed not only to damage infrastructure, but to test the psychological limits of a society facing another freezing winter. And as the explosions echoed across Ukrainian cities, one question hung heavily in the air was this: the opening move of a decisive Russian escalation, or the spark for something far more dangerous? According to data later cited by Western defense analysts, the attack involved dozens of long-range missiles and hundreds of drones launched in overlapping waves. The logic was familiar. Russian planners sought to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses through sheer volume, forcing interceptors to expend precious ammunition while gaps opened for missiles to slip through. Energy infrastructure was once again the priority. Substations around Kyiv and in several western regions were struck, triggering rolling blackouts and temporary disruptions to heating systems. Civilian casualties were reported, and for hours the capital flickered in and out of darkness, a stark reminder of how vulnerable modern cities become when electricity disappears. From Moscow's perspective, the timing was no accident. With diplomatic pressure mounting and Western capitals debating the next phase of military and financial support for Kyiv, the Kremlin appeared eager to project strength. Analysts in London and Washington noted that such large-scale strikes often coincide with moments when Russia wants to influence negotiations indirectly by demonstrating that it still retains the ability to inflict pain. Under President Donald Trump's current administration in the United States, Washington's message to Moscow had emphasized deterrence and burden sharing within NATO, but it also stressed the need to avoid uncontrolled escalation. This balance made the December barrage particularly risky, even by the war's brutal standards. Yet the immediate military impact of the strike told only part of the story. Ukrainian air defenses, though strained, intercepted a significant portion of incoming threats, a performance Western experts described as operationally resilient under saturation. Systems supplied by NATO members combined with domestically adapted solutions prevented a total collapse of the grid. The lights went out in places, but the state did not. And crucially, while Russian missiles and drones were drawing every radar and interceptor toward Ukrainian skies, something else was happening far beyond the front lines. Inside Ukraine's general staff, this attack was not seen as an isolated event, but as a signal. For months, Ukrainian planners had studied the rhythm of Russian strikes, noting how each large barrage temporarily fixed Russia's own air defense focus forward. Western intelligence assessments echoed in reports by Reuters and the BBC had repeatedly warned that Russia's vast territory made comprehensive air defense impossible. Protecting cities, industrial hubs, frontline forces, and energy infrastructure simultaneously was a mathematical challenge no system could fully solve. Ukraine understood this weakness and had been waiting for the moment when it became most exposed. Strategically, the December strike revealed a deeper shift. Russia was still trying to weaponize winter using cold and darkness as tools of coercion. Ukraine, backed politically and materially by NATO states, was preparing to redefine what retaliation looked like. Rather than responding symmetrically, Kyiv appeared ready to strike at nodes that sustained Russia's war effort itself. Western military analysts described this approach as a transition from defensive endurance to selective strategic pressure, a move designed to alter Moscow's cost-benefit calculations over time, rather than score immediate battlefield gains. For NATO and the broader West, the implications were profound. If Ukraine could demonstrate the capability to reach deep into Russia's strategic rear while absorbing large-scale attacks at home, the conflict would enter a new phase one where deterrence, escalation control, and economic vulnerability became as important as trenches and artillery. As the sirens finally fell silent that night and emergency crews worked through the darkness, observers across Europe began to realize that the real consequences of December 23rd had yet to unfold. Meanwhile, as analysts were still counting intercepts and damage in Kyiv, a very different kind of fire was already beginning to burn far inside Russia's own territory. While emergency crews in Ukraine were still restoring power and clearing debris, the mechanics behind Russia's December barrage were already under intense scrutiny in Western capitals. This was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a carefully constructed saturation operation, one that revealed both Moscow's remaining strengths and its growing limitations. Russian strategic bombers, including long-range platforms operating from distant airfields, launched missiles in coordinated sequences, while hundreds of attack drones were released to confuse radar operators and drain interceptor stocks. On paper, the plan was designed to exhaust Ukraine's defenses. In practice, it exposed how fragile that logic had become. Western defense analysts noted that the sheer number of drones used was unprecedented in a single night. Their purpose was not accuracy, but volume. By forcing Ukrainian air defense crews to track and engage dozens of slow-moving targets, Russia hoped to open corridors for faster, more lethal missiles. The psychological component was just as important. Sirens blaring for hours, social media flooded with explosion footage, and uncertainty about electricity and heating were all meant to sap morale. Russian state media framed the strike as proof that Ukraine's defenses were cracking under pressure. Yet the results did not match the rhetoric. Ukrainian forces adapted their response, prioritizing critical assets and accepting limited outages, rather than risking a total depletion of interceptor missiles. Western-supplied systems were used selectively, while cheaper countermeasures handled drones whenever possible. According to assessments later shared with Reuters and Defense News, this layered approach significantly reduced the effectiveness of Russia's saturation tactics. The grid suffered damage, but it did not collapse. Heating interruptions were temporary, and within hours, officials in Kyiv emphasized continuity rather than catastrophe. This resilience had broader implications. Russia's strategy relied on the assumption that repeated stress would eventually force political concessions. But under the current U.S. administration, led by President Donald Trump, NATO messaging had shifted toward long-term sustainability. The emphasis was no longer just on helping Ukraine survive each strike, but on enabling it to absorb pressure without strategic regression. In that context, the December barrage looked less like a turning point and more like a diminishing return on an increasingly expensive tactic. Civilian suffering, however, remained real. Reports confirmed casualties and significant hardship in affected regions. For ordinary Ukrainians, the experience reinforced a grim normality war had become woven into daily life. But this normalization also blunted the shock value Russia once relied upon. Western psychologists studying conflict resilience pointed out that societies under prolonged threat often develop coping mechanisms that reduce the intended impact of terror-based strategies. In simple terms, fear loses its strategic utility when it becomes routine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence services were analyzing the strike from a different angle. Every missile launch, every drone trajectory revealed data about Russian capabilities, logistics, and decision-making. By concentrating so many assets on a single offensive, Moscow inadvertently signaled where its priorities lay and where gaps might exist elsewhere. Analysts at several NATO think tanks described this as a classic case of operational tunnel vision. When one domain consumes attention, another becomes vulnerable. The night of December 23rd thus marked a subtle but critical inflection. Russia demonstrated that it could still assemble large-scale attacks, but it also confirmed that such efforts came at a cost, and not only financially. Each missile expended, each drone launched, represented resources not easily replaced under sanctions and production constraints. Western estimates suggested that replenishing stocks after such a barrage would take months, not weeks. For Ukraine, the lesson was clear. Enduring the strike was only the first phase. The second would involve reshaping the battlefield in ways Russia could not easily predict or defend against. The saturation attack intended to paralyze Ukraine instead provided the operational window Kyiv had been anticipating. And as Russian commanders focused on the immediate aftermath and public messaging, Ukrainian planners moved quietly from defense to execution. Yet the most consequential development was not visible on Ukrainian streets or in intercepted missile counts. It was unfolding hundreds of kilometers away, where industrial infrastructure long assumed to be beyond reach was about to become the next front in the war. What followed next shocked analysts across Europe and beyond. What made the next phase of the night so destabilizing was not its scale, but its precision. As Russian commanders assessed damage reports from Ukraine and state media rushed to declare success, Ukrainian long-range drones were already crossing hundreds of kilometers of airspace, aimed not at symbolic targets, but at the industrial sinews of Russia's war economy. Their destination was the Stavropol region deep inside Russia, far from the front lines, and long considered strategically insulated from direct attack. That assumption was about to collapse. The city of Budyonnovsk sits quietly on the Russian map, but its significance to the war effort is anything but modest. There, the Stavrolen petrochemical complex functions as a critical supplier of polymer materials essential to modern military production. Western analysts have repeatedly emphasized that contemporary warfare depends not only on steel and explosives, but on plastics, composites, and synthetic materials used in drones, vehicles, insulation, and electronics. Stavrolen was one of the places where those materials came to life. Ukrainian drones struck with calculated intent. Rather than spreading damage across peripheral facilities, they targeted the most sensitive nodes, ethylene cracking units, and gas separation workshops. These are not easily repaired structures. According to industrial experts cited in European media, damage to such components can halt production for months, not days. Videos later verified by open-source intelligence analysts showed massive fires engulfing the complex, illuminating the night sky, and overwhelming local emergency response. The strategic meaning of this strike extended far beyond a single blaze. Stavrolen is among Russia's largest producers of high-density polyethylene and polymer feedstocks. These materials are used extensively in unmanned aerial vehicles, from airframes to internal components, as well as in protective gear and vehicle systems. By disrupting this supply, Ukraine was not merely retaliating. It was attacking the future tempo of Russian military production. Some Western estimates suggested that the shutdown could reduce Russia's drone output by a significant margin over the coming months, creating bottlenecks that no rapid workaround could easily fix. For Moscow, the psychological impact was immediate. The Kremlin had long reassured the public that while the war was costly, it would remain distant. Fires in Stavropol told a different story. The war was no longer confined to televised updates from the front. It was now visibly burning within Russia's industrial heartland. Social media reactions from within the country reflected a mix of disbelief and unease sentiments that Russian authorities struggled to contain with routine statements. From a Western strategic perspective, the strike validated a growing assessment Ukraine was shifting from reactive defense to proactive economic warfare. Analysts at NATO-aligned think tanks described the attack as an example of selective deep strike doctrine where limited assets are used to generate disproportionate long-term effects. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. officials had publicly emphasized the importance of Ukraine, focusing on targets that degrade Russia's capacity to sustain the war rather than chasing purely symbolic victories. Stavropol fit that logic almost perfectly. Equally important was what the strike revealed about Russian air defense. Systems designed to protect major cities and frontline formations could not simultaneously shield distant industrial facilities. The vastness of Russian territory, once seen as a strategic buffer, had become a liability. Every additional site defended meant another left exposed. Western military experts referred to this as the blanket problem. No matter how advanced the systems there simply were not enough to cover everything. As flames continued to burn through the night in Stavropol, one conclusion became unavoidable. Ukraine had demonstrated that Russia's depth was no longer safe, and that industrial targets would now carry strategic risk. Yet even as attention focused on this unprecedented strike, Ukrainian operations were already expanding southward toward the arteries that financed the war itself. Meanwhile, another critical node was about to come under pressure at the edge of the Black Sea. If the fire in Stavropol signaled an assault on Russia's industrial future, the next move struck at something even more immediate: cash flow. As dawn approached, Ukrainian drones shifted their focus southward toward the Krasnodar region, home to some of Russia's most vital energy export infrastructure. There, near the entrance to the Kerch Strait, sits the Tamaneftegaz terminal, a key gateway through which oil, liquefied petroleum gas, and refined fuel products move from Russian pipelines onto tankers bound for foreign markets. This was not a battlefield target in the traditional sense. It was an economic choke point. The choice of Taman was deliberate. Western energy analysts have long described the terminal as one of the arteries sustaining Russia's war finances, particularly as European markets closed and exports pivoted toward Asia and the global south. Any disruption there carries consequences that ripple through shipping schedules, insurance markets, and state revenue projections. Ukrainian drones struck fuel storage tanks, pipeline connections, and port facilities, igniting fires that Russian authorities could not fully conceal. Despite initial statements minimizing the damage, regional officials were soon forced to acknowledge that a blaze had broken out following a Ukrainian attack. What mattered most was not the visual drama of burning tanks, but the operational aftermath. According to maritime risk assessments cited by Western shipping observers, even temporary damage to loading infrastructure can paralyze port operations for weeks. Safety inspections, repairs, and heightened security protocols slow throughput dramatically. For a country already selling its energy at discounted prices due to sanctions, delays translate directly into lost revenue. In effect, Ukraine was not just destroying hardware, it was injecting uncertainty into Russia's most reliable income stream. This move carried a sharp strategic message. While Russia attempted to plunge Ukrainian cities into darkness, Ukraine responded by threatening to turn off the financial tap that fueled those attacks. Western economists noted the asymmetry: power outages, though painful, are often reversible within days, whereas disruptions to energy exports undermined fiscal planning and investor confidence. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. officials had repeatedly underscored that economic pressure, when applied to the right nodes, could be as decisive as battlefield victories. Taman represented such a node. The geopolitical implications quickly became apparent. Insurance premiums for tankers operating in the Black Sea rose almost immediately, reflecting increased perceived risk. Shipping companies already cautious began reassessing routes and schedules. For Russia, this meant that even undamaged facilities faced secondary effects, simply because the region was now viewed as unstable. Analysts at international energy consultancies warned that sustained pressure on ports like Taman and nearby hubs could force Moscow to reroute exports through longer, more expensive paths, further eroding margins. Crucially, this strike did not occur in isolation. It was part of a pattern emerging over several weeks, one that linked military retaliation to commercial vulnerability. By targeting export infrastructure, Ukraine was signaling a shift toward what Western strategists call integrated deterrence, combining military, economic, and informational tools to alter an adversary's behavior. NATO officials, speaking off the record, suggested that such operations complicate Russia's ability to escalate without incurring costs that extend far beyond the battlefield. As the smoke at Taman drifted over the Black Sea, another layer of the story came into focus. This was not only about energy or retaliation, but about rules, specifically who gets to feel safe in maritime trade. The roots of Ukraine's decision lay in earlier incidents involving civilian shipping incidents that had quietly reset Kyiv's red lines. Yet as the implications of the Taman strike sank in, observers began to ask what events had pushed Ukraine toward this new doctrine in the first place. What followed next would trace the conflict back to a single port and a single missile strike that changed everything. To understand why Ukraine was willing to take such a bold step against Russia's Black Sea energy infrastructure, it is necessary to rewind the clock by less than 2 weeks to an incident that quietly reshaped Kyiv's strategic calculus. On December 12th, at the port of Chornomorsk, near Odessa, a missile strike hit a civilian cargo vessel operating under entirely commercial conditions. The ship, owned by a Turkish company and carrying humanitarian and trade goods, was not engaged in any military activity. Yet it became collateral in Russia's attempt to choke Ukraine's maritime lifeline. The damage was significant. Fires broke out on deck, critical equipment was destroyed, and the crew was forced to evacuate in chaos. Reports later confirmed that multiple Turkish-linked vessels were affected in the same attack wave. For Ukraine, this was not just another strike on port infrastructure. It was a direct assault on international shipping, and by extension, on the principle that civilian maritime trade should remain insulated from deliberate targeting. President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly condemned the incident, framing it as an act of terror against global commerce, rather than a purely bilateral act of war. Western governments took note. Turkey, a NATO member with a delicate balancing role in the Black Sea, found itself uncomfortably close to the line separating neutrality from confrontation. Analysts in Brussels and Washington warned that such strikes risked expanding the conflict's scope by undermining confidence in international trade routes. Under President Donald Trump's administration, the U.S. position emphasized freedom of navigation and the protection of civilian shipping, even as it sought to avoid direct military entanglement. The Chornomorsk incident exposed the fragility of that balance. From Kyiv's perspective, the message was unmistakable. If Russia was prepared to endanger foreign civilian vessels to pressure Ukraine's economy, then Ukraine could no longer treat Russian maritime trade as off-limits. What emerged from this assessment was a doctrine Ukrainian officials would later describe in private briefings to Western partners as symmetric retaliation. The logic was stark, but clear attacks on Ukrainian ports and merchant ships would be answered with attacks on Russian ports and export infrastructure. The battlefield was expanding into the realm of trade. This shift was reinforced days later on December 20th, when another Russian missile strike hit Odessa's port facilities, killing civilians and further degrading cargo handling capacity. According to reporting by major Western outlets, these strikes were part of a broader Russian effort to deter maritime insurers and shipping companies from operating in Ukrainian ports. For Kyiv, the pattern confirmed that restraint was no longer producing security. Instead, it was inviting escalation without consequence. The response took shape quickly. Rather than issuing diplomatic protests alone, Ukraine prepared to demonstrate that maritime insecurity would cut both ways. The subsequent attack on the Taman terminal was thus not an impulsive act, but the operationalization of a new rule set. If Ukrainian grain corridors and civilian-linked shipping were vulnerable, so too would be Russia's oil terminals and tankers. Western military analysts described this as a calculated escalation designed to rebalance deterrence, not abandon it. The broader strategic effect was immediate. Insurance markets reacted sharply, premiums surged, and shipping risk assessments were revised. For Russia, whose energy exports depend on predictable maritime logistics, this represented a long-term headache rather than a short-term disruption. NATO observers noted that Ukraine had effectively internationalized the cost of Russian actions by tying them to global trade stability. Every missile aimed at a Ukrainian port now carried the implicit risk of economic retaliation elsewhere. By late December, it was clear that the Black Sea was no longer merely a backdrop to the war. It had become an active arena of strategic signaling. Ukraine's message was blunt, but measured security at sea is indivisible. Yet even as this maritime doctrine took hold, events on land were accelerating in ways that further eroded Russia's sense of control. Deep inside the country, far from the coast, a different kind of instability was beginning to surface, one that struck at the myth of a protected homeland. By the time the consequences of the Black Sea strikes were being absorbed by shipping markets and energy traders, Russia was facing a parallel shock much closer to its political core. On December 22, just one day before the massive aerial exchange, a senior Russian military officer was killed in Moscow when an explosive device detonated near his vehicle. The attack carried out in the heart of the capital shattered a long-standing assumption that Russia's leadership and security elites remained insulated from the war's direct effects. Investigators moved quickly, hinting at Ukrainian involvement, but the deeper damage was already done. The illusion of domestic safety had cracked. For Moscow's ruling circles, this incident carried weight far beyond the loss of a single officer. It signaled that the conflict had entered a phase where symbolic and psychological targets mattered as much as industrial or military ones. Western intelligence analysts observed that such attacks tend to amplify internal anxiety disproportionately, especially among elites accustomed to controlled environments. Under prolonged conflict, fear spreads upward, altering decision-making and risk tolerance at the very top. The unrest did not stop there. In the days surrounding the December barrage, fires were reported at railway hubs deep inside Russia, including in regions thousands of kilometers from the front. Fuel tankers and military cargo trains burned, disrupting logistics networks already under strain. Western reporting linked these incidents to sabotage, whether by Ukrainian operatives or internal resistance groups emboldened by Moscow's perceived vulnerability. Either explanation pointed to the same conclusion: Russia's internal lines of communication were no longer secure. The civilian impact soon followed. Fuel shortages appeared in parts of southern Russia and Crimea, with long queues forming at gas stations and reports of opportunistic theft becoming common. For a country that prides itself on energy abundance, such scenes were deeply unsettling. According to assessments cited by Reuters, these shortages were less about absolute supply and more about distribution failures caused by disrupted transport and heightened security measures. Yet perception mattered. Public confidence, already frayed, took another hit. Strategically, these developments converged into a single problem for the Kremlin. Russia's air defense network, though formidable on paper, could not protect everything at once. Systems concentrated around Moscow left industrial regions exposed. Redeployments to protect energy infrastructure risked weakening frontline coverage. Western military experts referred again to the short blanket dilemma: cover one area and another is left bare. Ukraine, by contrast, was exploiting this imbalance with increasing sophistication. For NATO and the United States, now led by President Donald Trump, the message was complex, but unmistakable. Ukraine's actions demonstrated that sustained support had enabled not just survival, but adaptation. By shifting pressure into Russia's strategic depth economically, psychologically, and logistically, Kyiv was altering the long-term equation of the war. Western officials cautioned that escalation risks remained, but they also acknowledged that Russia's leverage was eroding faster than many had predicted. As December drew to a close, one truth stood out. The night Russia sought to plunge Ukraine into darkness had instead illuminated the vulnerabilities of its own system. What began as a bid for intimidation ended as a lesson in overextension. And as policymakers in Moscow, Washington, and Brussels recalculated their next moves, the war's center of gravity appeared to be shifting once again away from spectacle toward endurance. Yet the question now confronting all sides was unavoidable. How long can a state sustain a conflict when its front lines, factories, finances, and even its capital are all under pressure at the same time?